June 6, 1944. The biggest invasion in human history just happened. Over 150,000 soldiers landed on the beaches of Normandy. Thousands of tanks rolled inland. Planes filled the sky. Everyone thinks the hard part was the landing, getting past those machine gun nests, climbing those cliffs. But the real nightmare was about to begin, and it had nothing to do with combat. The Allied forces were burning through fuel at a terrifying rate, and there was no way to get enough of it to France. The invasion was about to stall before it even really started. Here's the thing nobody tells you about war. Armies don't just need bullets and brave soldiers. They need fuel. Lots of it. And in World War II, fuel meant everything. A single tank could burn through 60 gallons in just 100 miles. Multiply that by thousands of tanks. Then add tens of thousands of trucks, jeeps, half-tracks, ambulances, supply vehicles. And that's just on the ground. In the air, bombers and fighters were guzzling fuel by the hundreds of thousands of gallons every single day. Before D-Day even happened, Allied planners sat down and did the math. They calculated that once the invasion started, they would need to deliver 1 million gallons of fuel per day to keep the war machine moving. 1 million gallons, every single day. And that number would only go up as they pushed deeper into Europe. But how do you get 1 million gallons of fuel across the English Channel every day? The Channel is one of the roughest bodies of water in the world. Storms come out of nowhere. The currents are unpredictable. And oh yeah, there are German U-boats, mines, and bombers trying to sink anything that moves. The initial plan was to use tanker ships, big cargo ships that would sail back and forth carrying fuel. Sounds simple enough, right? Wrong. Tanker ships are slow, really slow. Each trip took days, and you can't just pull up to a beach and start pumping fuel. The Normandy coast didn't have proper harbors. The Allies had to build temporary ones called mulberry harbors, but even those had limitations. Ships had to wait their turn to unload. Rough seas meant delays. Storms meant nothing moved at all. Then there was the danger. German submarines were still prowling the Channel. A single torpedo could send hundreds of thousands of gallons of fuel to the bottom of the ocean. And it got worse. Even when fuel did make it to France, it still had to be transported inland to the front lines. That meant more trucks, which meant burning more fuel just to deliver fuel. The logistics were becoming a nightmare. Within weeks of D-Day, the problem became a crisis. The Allied advance was moving faster than anyone expected. Patton's Third Army was racing across France, and his tanks were running dry. There are reports of entire tank divisions sitting idle, not because they were damaged, not because the soldiers were tired, but because they had no fuel. Patton was furious. He reportedly said his tanks could reach Berlin in days if someone would just give him the damn gasoline. The Red Ball Express, a legendary truck convoy system, was set up to rush supplies to the front. Thousands of trucks, driven mostly by African-American soldiers, worked around the clock. They drove with their headlights off at night to avoid being spotted by German planes. They pushed their vehicles to the breaking point. But even this heroic effort wasn't enough. The trucks themselves were burning massive amounts of fuel. For every 5 gallons they delivered, they burned one just getting there. It was unsustainable. By late summer of 1944, the fuel shortage was threatening to stop the entire Allied advance. Some generals were talking about having to pause operations. Pause. Can you imagine? After all that sacrifice on D-Day, after all those lives lost, the invasion might grind to a halt because of fuel. Hitler would have loved that. It would have given Germany time to regroup, to reinforce, to build new weapons. The entire war could have changed. But behind the scenes, something absolutely wild was already in motion. Something so ambitious that when it was first proposed, people thought it was impossible. It was called Operation PLUTO, pipeline under the ocean. The idea was insane. Build a pipeline, a massive fuel pipeline, and lay it on the bottom of the English Channel, from England to France. Under the water, in the middle of a war, through enemy territory. past mines and submarines and all the chaos of active combat. When this plan was first brought up in 1942, a lot of people laughed. A pipeline under the ocean? That's science fiction. That's not how war works. But a small group of engineers and planners knew it was the only real solution. Ships would never be enough. Trucks would never be enough. If the Allies were going to win, they needed a direct line of fuel flowing constantly from England to France. An artery. A lifeline that couldn't be cut. The man who really pushed this forward was a guy named Arthur Hartley. He was the chief engineer at the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, which would later become BP. Hartley wasn't a soldier. He was an oil man. But he understood something the military didn't. Pipelines could move more fuel, more reliably, than any other method. He'd built pipelines across deserts and mountains. Why not under the sea? But this wasn't just any pipeline. The engineering challenges were staggering. First, you need pipe that can handle salt water. Salt water corrodes metal fast. Second, you need pipe that can handle the water pressure at depth. The channel isn't super deep, but it's deep enough to crush weak pipe. Third, you need pipe that's flexible enough to lay on an uneven ocean floor without breaking. And fourth, you need miles and miles and miles of this pipe. We're not talking about a few 100 feet. We're talking about running pipe from the Isle of Wight and Dungeness in England all the way to France. That's over 70 miles per line. Two main types of pipe were developed. The first was called HAIS, which stood for Hartley Anglo-Iranian steel. This was 3-inch steel pipe wrapped in layers of protection. But steel is heavy and rigid. So they also developed Hamel, named after the two chief engineers, Hartley and a guy named Ellis. Hamel pipe was made of lead with a steel core. Lead is heavier than steel, which helped it sink and stay on the ocean floor. But lead is also softer, more flexible. It could bend and move with the ocean currents without snapping. Here's where it gets really clever. How do you lay 70 miles of pipe underwater? You can't just swim it out there piece by piece. So they came up with something brilliant. They wound the pipe onto giant floating drums called conundrums. These things were massive. Picture a floating spool the size of a small building. They'd load 70 miles of pipe onto one of these drums, then tow it across the channel with a ship. As the ship moved, the pipe would unspool and sink to the bottom, but they had to test it first. You can't just roll this out on D-Day and hope it works. So in 1943, they ran test pipelines across the Bristol Channel and the Clyde in Scotland. They tested different pipe materials, different laying techniques. They pumped fuel through them at different pressures to see what would work, and slowly, painfully, they figured it out. The whole operation was top secret. Secrecy level was as high as the atomic bomb. Workers who built the pipe and drums were told they were working on a project called communications cable, or decoy systems. Nobody knew what Pluto really was, except a tiny circle of people at the very top. If the Germans found out the Allies were planning to run fuel lines under the channel, they'd do everything possible to stop it. They'd send divers to cut the pipes. They'd bomb the pumping stations. The element of surprise was critical. Production ramped up through 1943 and into 1944. Factories across Britain were secretly manufacturing pipe sections. Engineers were building massive pumping stations on the English coast. These weren't small operations. The pumping stations had to be powerful enough to push fuel through 70 miles of pipe sitting on the ocean floor. That requires serious pressure. They built disguised pump houses that looked like ordinary buildings or were hidden inside fake bungalows and cottages. Some were even built to look like seaside ice cream shops. From the outside, they looked harmless. Inside, they were pumping thousands of gallons of fuel per hour. Then came the drums. Building the conundrums was an engineering feat on its own. Each one had to be perfectly balanced so it would float correctly. The pipe had to be wound with exact tension so it wouldn't kink or tangle. And remember, They needed multiple lines. The plan called for dozens of pipelines, not just one. Redundancy was built in. If one line broke, others would keep flowing. D-Day happened on June 6, 1944, but Pluto didn't go live right away. The first lines weren't laid until August. Why? Because laying a pipeline in the middle of an active war zone is incredibly dangerous. They had to wait until the Allies had secured the French coast enough to protect the landing points. They also had to clear mines from the routes. German mines were everywhere in the Channel. One mine hitting a conundrum would destroy months of work in seconds. On August 12, 1944, the first Pluto line went live. A pipe was laid from Shanklin on the Isle of Wight to Cherbourg in France. That first day, fuel started flowing under the ocean. It worked. Actually worked. Fuel that was being pumped in England was coming out of the ground in France 70 miles away without a single ship involved. The impact was immediate. Suddenly fuel was arriving faster and more reliably than ever before. Patton's tanks started moving again. Supply officers who'd been tearing their hair out for weeks suddenly had fuel to distribute. The Pluto lines didn't solve the fuel crisis overnight, but they made a massive difference. By the end of August, more lines were laid. From Dungeness to Boulogne. More routes, more capacity, more fuel. By the time the war ended, Operation Pluto had laid over 700 miles of pipeline under the Channel. Not one line. Multiple lines running parallel. Some were 3 inches in diameter, others were larger. Together they were pumping over 1 million gallons of fuel per day at their peak. 1 million gallons. Exactly what the planners said they needed back in 1942. The numbers are staggering. Over the course of the operation, Pluto delivered around 180 million gallons of fuel to Europe. That's enough to fill nearly 300 Olympic swimming pools. That fuel powered the tanks that liberated Paris. It powered the trucks that delivered supplies to starving civilians. It powered the planes that bombed German factories into rubble. It powered the final push into Germany itself. And here's the kicker. The Germans never really figured it out. They knew the Allies were getting fuel somehow, but they never discovered the pipelines. A few pipes were damaged by storms or accidents, but not one was sabotaged by enemy action. The secrecy held. Even after the war, Pluto stayed classified for years. The engineers who built it couldn't talk about it. The soldiers who saw the pumping stations didn't know what they were looking at. It was one of the best-kept secrets of the entire war. Think about what Pluto really represents. It's not just a pipeline. It's a perfect example of how wars are won behind the scenes. Everyone remembers the soldiers storming the beaches, the pilots in dogfights, the generals making bold moves. But wars are won by the people who solve the boring problems, the logistics, the engineering, the unglamorous work of making sure fuel gets from point A to point B. Without Pluto, the advance into Europe would have stalled. There's no question. The Red Ball Express was heroic, but it couldn't keep up. Tanker ships were helpful, but too slow and too vulnerable. Pluto was the solution nobody saw coming. A hidden artery pumping life into the Allied war machine. It didn't fire a single shot, but it might have done more to win the war than any individual battle. The engineers who designed it never got parades. Most of their names are forgotten. The workers who built the pipes and drums went back to normal life without recognition. But what they built was extraordinary. They took an impossible idea and made it real. They laid hundreds of miles of pipe on the bottom of the ocean in the middle of the most destructive war in history. And it worked. That's the story nobody tells about D-Day. The invasion didn't succeed just because of brave soldiers. It succeeded because somewhere in England, a bunch of engineers figured out how to pump fuel under the ocean. Operation Pluto wasn't just a clever idea. It was the difference between victory and stalemate. It was the hidden engine of the Allied advance. It was the secret pipeline that won World War II. If this kind of untold history blows your mind, check out how one invention brought soldiers back from the brink of death.